All right, let's go ahead and get started.
All right, so who knows if other folks might join in, or maybe we'll catch the recording later, and that's fine too. I will say that the topic that we wanted to address with this live stream was how to talk to kids about sex, but really, I guess more specifically, how to talk to teenagers or young adults about their sexuality, and everything that's wrapped into that, the dating and sex, and how to address those kind of topics with, I guess, older kids or young adults, especially.
Oh, and I would say even if you don't have older kids, I think it's helpful to have that goal in mind. What is that mindset of where our conversations with our younger kids should be leading?
I 100% agree. And I think that's really a foundational point about talking to anybody about sex, is what is our ultimate goal. But especially when we're talking to young people, however young they might be, if we don't have a goal in mind as far as what we want them to understand in a more mature way, then we're never going to be able to boil that down to how do we talk to a 2-year-old. We need a goal in mind.
Right.
So that's a great point, Jen. And I will say, I'll add to this, my motivation for doing this topic is a little bit selfish, because in 2 weeks or less, we're going to be talking to a big group of college-aged and maybe some young adults in Bowling Green, Kentucky.
Right.
So we're looking forward to that, but also, that's not our typical audience.
Right. Right.
And
we've talked a couple of times to singles groups. But yeah, we're kind of going through what is that material, what works best for this age group.
Right. So in that preparation, there were some things that I wanted to kind of share that I've gathered, but also I was hoping for some feedback as far as what am I missing here, or what
maybe we scared them all off though,
so.
And nobody has feedback for us.
And maybe Sunday night's just not a good night for this, and we get that. That's part of the experiment, is trying to find what's the best time for people to do this, and Sunday night may not be the best night for that. I get that. So
yes, so we have one couple on right now, Jacob and Anna. Whenever y'all need to go, don't worry about it.
Yeah,
we'll probably go through the material and just so we can have this recording and post it on Covenant Club, but we'll see.
Yeah. So if we get feedback, great. And maybe we don't get feedback in this venue. Maybe we get feedback from emails or other messages on the forums, on the posted boards or whatever. And that would be fine too. But really what we're looking toward is, what do we need to be telling our kids? What are the messages that they need to hear, especially in light of the culture that they're growing up in,
right?
Which is very different than the culture that we grew up in.
Right. And if we as parents don't have that in the forefront of our mind, like, this is a different world for our kids when it comes to sexuality and sex. And therefore we've got to be all the more proactive. I mean, a lot of us in our generation, we wish our parents had talked to us more about sex. And there were certainly, some detrimental things that happened for a lot of us who grew up in homes where sex wasn't being talked about. But we weren't growing up in a society where, I mean, sex is just so skewed and so
it's being talked about everywhere by everyone.
Right.
Every outlet, our kids are being overwhelmed. And so it's
all the more important then for us to be talking about this with our kiddos.
And I think that kind of leads to one of the first points that we wanted to make is, why should especially our teenagers, come to us as their parents for advice about sex and sexuality? What motivation are we giving our kids to come to us instead of everybody else that's talking about it?
Right. I mean, can't our kids just read a book? Can't they just look at a website?
Well, yes, they can. And they will, and they do. And everybody else, wants to talk to them. Why shouldn't they instead of coming to me as their parent, why shouldn't I just send them to their Bible class teacher? right? Isn't that the church's job, to teach my kids about sex and their sexuality?
Or maybe we think it's the public school's job.
Sure.
Why not just send them to a health science teacher, or even a friend, but are those really the sources that we want for our kids to turn to learn about their sexuality?
Yeah, because I will say that in general, the consensus among teenagers, and I'm not necessarily talking about your teenagers specifically, but I'm talking about teenagers as a general rule and young adults as a general rule, the consensus among young people is that their parents are clueless about sex and sexuality.
Right. The events that we have held with singles and the feedback we get is that the vast majority of them make statements like, my parents have never talked to me about this. I've never, and frankly, like our kids, the word is out what it is that we do. And the most common feedback that our kids get is, I can't imagine having parents that talk to me and talk that openly about sex. Like, that doesn't happen in my home. That should be a wake-up call to all of us.
Yes.
That the most teenagers say their parents don't know anything about sex. Well, right. Do they?
Well, I mean, I hope that your teenagers recognize that you were the ones that had sex in order to create those children, right?
Most of them.
So why then are they not coming to us about the questions they have about sexuality?
Right.
What message have they gotten from us that we're not the experts? Right. What message have they gotten from us that we are clueless? Why do they think we are clueless? Right. Now, again, I don't know you personally, or I don't know all of your kids personally by any means. So I can't speak to that question in your house, but I would challenge you with that question. Do your kids think that you are the expert when it comes to sex and sexuality? And if not, why not?
Why not?
Are they coming to you with questions? Because don't think that your kids don't have questions. They have questions. And if they're not asking you those questions, who are they asking?
Right.
And why? That I think is the big challenge to us as parents. Because I mean, silence, if I'm not talking to my kids about this, silence is the greatest enemy of sexual wholeness in a culture, whether that's in the church, and we've seen what silence in the church has done to sexuality and all of the problems that has created over the last 100 years or more. But that's also true in your home. If there's silence about sexuality, that is a huge enemy towards your kids growing up and coming out of your household with sexual wholeness, with a full understanding of their sexuality and with sexual purity intact. That's going to be a great difficulty if they don't know what to do with their sexuality. So Tina Shermer Sellers, you've heard us probably quote this a million times, but I'm going to say it again. She says, if you want to protect your kids while raising them and have them want to be close to you while in their teens, research shows that you must become a good sex educator. If you want to have, in other words, if you want to have a good relationship with your kids, a key component of having a good relationship with teenagers is being able to talk to them about sex. If they don't trust you to talk to them about sex, they're not going to trust you with very much else about their life. And right. You're not going to be able to build any kind of solid relationship. And so she recommends calm, age appropriate, and comprehensive sex education, which requires 1,000 1-minute conversations.
I think, and I'm like you were saying, we've used that before. But that was something that really reframed and refocused us when it came to how we were parenting our kids in regards to just how we're talking to them about having this, switching from this mindset of the talk to that 1,000 1-minute conversations. It took a lot of pressure off of us because it wasn't about having a perfect, I have all the answers, I have it totally lined up, I'm ready to go, and we're going to do this one time and done. But rather, we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about this in small little ways throughout their lifetime, and one conversation isn't enough, nor is one conversation have to be perfect.
Yeah, the whole conversation or the whole talk doesn't hinge on one conversation.
And there's been plenty of things. I mean, how we're able to talk and explain and excuse me, and parent our 15-year-old daughter now compared to when our oldest was 15 is pretty
It's very,
different. I
very
mean, that's
different.
9 years of growing that we have done ourselves in our marriage. But, having that mindset of, I'm just going to keep talking and I'm going to keep learning as I go. And there's plenty of conversations that I can look back on and be like, I
Right.
probably didn't have that answer quite right. And now I have it in a different way. But when you reframe it in that, we're going to keep talking, even when I'm uncomfortable, even when you're uncomfortable, even when I don't even know all the answers.
Yeah.
We're going to keep talking because our
Absolutely.
kids need to see that we are the authority when
Yes.
it comes to their sexuality.
Yeah, and that comes from building relationship. I think foundationally, that's about building relationship. We have to be willing to hear them talk about everything else, even the minutia and the uninteresting
They will
parts.
talk and they will talk.
Yes, and you have to immerse yourselves in the drama that they're feeling, and they have to know that you feel all of the feelings that they're trying to feel at the same time. So listening to them in the small things means that they will believe you when you tell them you want to hear them in the big things.
Mhm.
They will bring you the big things if they know and can trust that you will be there and hear them. So building a relationship, I think, is a big part of that. But then also, you have to be informed.
Mhm.
You have to be willing to learn the anatomy. You have to be able to be willing to learn the slang terminology. I mean, if they know that you're not one of the cool parents, then they're going to believe that your authority means nothing. Then
Right.
you have no credibility.
Yeah, you don't have to have the perfect answers to everything. Sometimes it's learning to lean into the question.
Yeah.
And learning to say, well, I don't really know. What do you think about XYZ? I mean, when they come to you, I heard this at school and I saw this, and this kid lives in a home where this is or isn't happening, and they want to know, what do you think about that? You've got to be able to lean into that. And sometimes that's, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Let's dig
Yeah.
in deep together, and especially when it comes to things that are happening in their body, you got to be able to willing to talk about how they're feeling and what changes are happening.
Yeah. And I can assure you, when they bring you a question, it's not because they don't know the answer or have the answer. They think something about it, and that's worth exploring. Sometimes, even if I can't come up with the answer right off and this is like parenting pro tip. If you don't know the answer, and this is also like teaching in a Bible class or whatever, this is pro tip. If you don't have the answer, sometimes the best response is, what do you think about it? And now you've started a conversation. Okay. And that also opens up the door to them as, well, maybe my opinion actually matters in this.
Yeah.
And if they know that their opinion matters, they know that you're going to hear them, regardless of how outrageous their thought process might be. If they know that you'll listen, then they're going to bring it to you next time as well.
Well, and I think that goes back to that, have 1,001 minute conversations, not lectures.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big mind shift for us too, that we were going to talk about this with our kids, which meant we were going to hear their voice too. It wasn't going to be like every opportunity I had, I was going to lecture them on, their sexuality and their body and anatomy and the dangers of pornography, and who they should and shouldn't date. If I approached it from the standpoint of, this is all about lecturing, we would have shut it down.
Oh yeah.
That it has to be about conversations, which means sometimes they will say things to you and your immediate gut reaction is, that is not right. But a wise parent is one that takes that and helps gently reframe that instead of just shutting it down and telling them how they're wrong and you're right.
Absolutely.
Which is scary. It's scary to have your kids sit there and say things, thoughts and ideas that you're like, I don't know about that. With, your gut is to shut that down. Like, be sure and teach them what's right. But just recognize when you do that, you're shutting down their willingness to express with you. So
Yeah.
you want these conversations to happen over and over and over again. And you want to be hearing their voice, even when their voice is not quite that correct way of looking at something.
Yeah, and that can be a fine line. I mean, you obviously you have to stand up for what's right in your house, but you also need to make sure that that conversation is continued. Yeah, one of the best things, one of the tactics that I learned from my dad, which I appreciate, is when we would drive in the car. Of course, this was like before we had CD players or Spotify or whatever in our car. All we had,
CD players is old.
I know. All we had was an FM radio, an FM and AM radio. And so, you know, when we were kids as teenagers sitting in the back of the van, we wanted to listen to music. My dad wanted to listen to talk radio. Well, there were plenty of times my dad tolerated listening to the popular music, but we wanted him to just put the sound in the back of the van so only we could hear it. But he was not having that. He wanted all of us to listen to the music together. And then he would occasionally turn the radio off and ask us, what did that person just say? What did they sing? What are the lyrics in that song saying? And what does that mean? And what do you think about that? And he would really challenge us as to what's really being said there. Same thing with TV shows. He would, pause the TV show, or during the commercial breaks, we would have to talk to him about what is actually happening here and talk about the relationship dynamics and or right and wrong in lots of other ways, not just about sex, but in a lot of other ways, politically and every other way.
But I think that's a really important key is taking advantage of the ways in which your children are being influenced and even introduced to sexuality outside of your home. Like, don't just shut that off, but pull that in. So what songs are they listening to? Listen to it with them. What are the lyrics of the popular songs? Don't just say to them, we're not ever listening to this artist. Look at the lyrics of that song with your kid and say, why not?
What do you think about these lyrics? And
right now, I'm not saying like print out all the explicit music and play that for your kid. I'm just saying our goal is to help our children know how to think about their sexuality, which means we need to be arming them. We need to be leading them in the formation of the right thoughts. And so that means there is an element of exposing and learning to look at that through the lens of God's word.
Yeah, and look, you can start with Disney movies if you want. Disney movies teach a lot about sex, right, and sexuality, don't they? I mean, because sexuality is about so much more than just the mechanics of sexual intercourse, right? We think that the most important part of sex ed for kids is teaching them that a penis goes in a vagina, and that's like, and then the second part, the second layer of that is, don't do it until you get married. And that's the whole of our sexual education for our kids in some cases, if they get even that. But sexuality has spiritual and emotional and relational significance that far surpasses, I should say, that limited mindset of just saving sex for marriage. Right. We think that, the primary message that we need to get across to our kids is that they need to save sex for marriage. But that is such a small part about teaching our kids about their sexuality. I mean, sexuality is about gender identity. I mean, isn't that a big topic of the day?
I was going to say, that wasn't something we grew up with. And, the majority of our listeners.
It was just assumed that we all were on the same page.
We understood that there was male and female, but you need to know your children are not growing up in a world, as crazy as that is. They are not growing up in a world where it is believed that there is just male and female. So you need to be talking about.
They're not learning that from culture. I mean, I learned that from culture, but your kids are not going to learn that from culture.
Right.
Sexuality is about deep desire. It's about longing. It's about that desire that drives us toward each other to connect with one another. We need to be teaching our kids about their sexual desire and what's the purpose of that and where does that come from. It's about seeking pleasure, right? I mean, sexuality is about, it's a source of pleasure. for us. And so we need to learn how to use that and shape that in the right ways and with the right, for the right outlets and for the right purpose. And to be sure that we understand that it's about pleasure for another person. That there's so much more to even say about that, but it's about tapping into that creative power. It's about creating life, right? It's about procreation. That sexuality is tied up in procreation. And why is that? And what's the importance of that? It's about body image. I mean, that's something that many of us don't get a lot of instruction for, and we don't go out of our way to talk to our teenagers about body image, but that's tied up so tightly with sexuality. Right. And maybe that's one reason why we've not done a great job of really proclaiming that, especially to our young ladies. Sexuality is tied up in dating and relationships, right? I mean, if you're teaching about the mechanics of sex separate from dating and relationships, we're missing the point. Right. Sex outside of relationship is horrible. It is abhorrent. Sex must be within the realm of relationship. And so teaching our young people how to navigate that, and especially even in just preparing them for marriage, if we're teaching them that sex is separate from the marriage relationship, we're doing them a great disservice. It's about maintaining physical, but also emotional and spiritual boundaries with another person, because it's about intimacy. It's about vulnerability. So we've got to be teaching our kids about maintaining all of those important boundaries in their relationships in general.
And so I think, I mean, the general thought there is that teaching our kid, we as parents need to see that teaching our children and young people about sexuality is so much bigger than I think we recognize. And so it's infiltrating all these different areas, and these are all areas that our young people need instruction, and they need to be hearing our voice as mom and dad, but wherever you have influence over young people, they need to hear your voice.
Right. So there's some resources that we would strongly recommend. I'm not going to list them out for you. We'll include them maybe in the notes on the boards. But I think we need to understand and focus again closely on what are our primary goals. And every conversation with our kids needs to emphasize and point toward those goals. And I think, again, that starts with what is the purpose of sex. And if I, as an adult, have to have a pretty solid understanding of what the purpose of sex is before I can try to share that with my kids, no matter what age they are.
Right.
So if I don't have a good grasp on that, then I'm never going to be able to share that with someone else in a healthy way.
Right. I mean, you've got to have a conversation between yourselves. Like, why did God make this?
Yes. And why is sexuality given to even children? Why is sexuality given to teenagers and young adults before they are married? Why did God create us sexually, male and female?
And then why is the act of sex only reserved for marriage?
Yeah.
Why did he make that?
So again, we don't have 10 hours to talk about all of the intricacies of all of that conversation, but that's something you need to solidify in your mind. If you have children, especially if you have children and you want to teach them about sex, then you've got to solidify that in your own mind. Just briefly, sex is for procreation, certainly, and that's an important aspect of it. And there's a lot of great conversation that can be had even about why did God choose sex as a means for procreation. But we also need to understand it's a motivator and a reminder that we were created for intimacy. Sex is part of that marriage relationship. It helps to define that relationship because it is a motivator and a reminder of intimacy.
Well, and it's a physical place of oneness that's meant to proclaim a much deeper oneness ultimately with our creator.
Yeah. And I think we are fooling ourselves if we are not open and honest about the fact that sex is pleasurable. If we skip that in our conversations with our kids, we're doing them a great disservice.
Right.
They're going to find that out on their own one way or another. And when they realize that you are holding out on that truth, that their sexuality is a source of pleasure, if they are not going to trust anything else you have to say about it.
But what they need to hear most is that the ultimate pleasure comes when sex is in covenant.
Right.
And that the pleasure that you can have with sex outside of the covenant of marriage is so tiny compared to the depth of pleasure within covenant. The number one way they're going to know that that is true is by watching your own marriage. And so obviously, appropriately, but your children need to know that you have great pleasure with one another, and that comes from your sexual relationship together, and not just the very act of sex itself, but the sharing of your sexuality together as a whole.
They will never believe that saving sex for marriage is worth it if they don't see that sex is pleasurable and something desirable in your life. That to me is the greatest evangelistic tool that you have in teaching your kids about the sanctity and purity of the sexual relationship, is if they know without a doubt that you have a fulfilling and pleasurable, mutually pleasurable sex life. Your kids should have no doubt that you enjoy one another and that you have a rewarding sex life. Otherwise, you're wasting your breath with anything else that you say. They will never believe you, because they can see in the world, or at least they're given the illusion in the world, that sex is better outside of marriage.
But I think it's helpful, even especially with young people, to dig into that lie a small amount. I mean, there's so much research that actually shows like how unpleasurable sex is in the hookup culture. I think our young people need to know that. Like, there's plenty of research out there where they are doing studies and surveys with these people that are participating in this hookup culture. They're not having orgasms regularly. Most of the women, they're not enjoying sex. It's hurtful, it's painful. Our kids need to know that there's a very big difference in what sex feels like outside of covenant and what it feels like inside covenant.
No, I agree. And in the research is certainly there supports what the truth is about it. But again, I think the biggest tool is they've got to see that it's true in your life. Otherwise, I think if they know that your sex life is terrible, what hope do they have that their marriage is going to be different?
Right.
So again, the other thing that is important in this conversation is the conversation of covenant. And I think Jen mentioned that, but it must be a conversation about the sacredness of that relationship, and that it must be reserved for that relationship.
Obviously, our puppy dog needs to talk.
He's joining in. So I think this also, and this is maybe a whole nother side of this conversation that we don't necessarily have time to go into great detail about, is dating, and how much dating is tied into this conversation about sexuality. And really, I think our culture misses this to a great extent, and we as Christians have just blindly followed the cultural examples of how to date without giving any real thought as to what is the purpose of dating, and how to date in a way that is healthy and preserves all of the proper emotional and spiritual and sexual boundaries. Instead, we've kind of followed culture's ways of dating without giving any good thought as to what's a better way or how would this work better in a way that, you know, is meaningful and helpful to young people. Again, I you know, we don't have time to delve into that deeply, but I think that's another really strong consideration that parents need to be thinking about well before your kids are 16 or 18, but something you need to be thinking about and teaching your kids about before they are of dating age, so that we can prepare them to do this in a way that is helpful to them.
Well, and number one is having a conversation about, is there a right dating age? I mean, we take kindergartners and we say, who's your boyfriend and girlfriend? And we think this is cute. Is that really the message that we want to be sending to our little bitties?
Yes, right. I mean, we live a culture that is constantly trying to pair people up, whether it's you know, even in you know, Valentine's Day parties in grade school. The emphasis is on, you know, who's your Valentine, and making sure that everybody has boyfriends and girlfriends. Junior high, we have dances in junior high where kids are encouraged to dress up, sometimes in revealing ways, and put them together in a situation where they can have these sort of pseudo relationships, or even just hook up, like put them together in what is assumed to be a temporary situation where they can have their hands all over each other for a known temporary situation. And we call that, you know, that's a sanctioned school function. Like, that's encouraged, and everybody's encouraged to go, and the parents get involved, and they decorate and put all this effort into it, and we spend money on all these outfits. I mean, same thing with high school prom and we encourage all of our high schoolers, they need to get a girlfriend or a boyfriend as soon as they can and pair them up. And we're just setting our kids up for disaster.
Now, it is right that your kids will they'll start noticing the opposite sex
sooner than you want them to.
And they'll start even desiring relationship.
Right.
And so the answer isn't to just deny that there is desire.
Right.
The answer is to teach your own children to acknowledge that desire and learn what is that supposed to be guiding me towards? Is my desire that's developing at age 12 meant for me to have an intimate relationship right now? Or is my desire right now meant to start pointing me towards ultimately a relationship in which I might be with one with another? You know, it's this mindset of, am I supposed to take my desires and immediately gratify myself in a selfish way?
Right. Emotionally, physically, sexually, and you know, because there's just as much emotional damage that occurs in these kind of situations as there is sexual damage.
Right. Or should we be teaching our kids maybe that desire has a right place, and it's not always about immediate gratification? You know, but you've got to have these conversations. You've got to start thinking when they're very young, what am I going to be teaching that the purpose of dating is, and how we go about doing that?
Right. So there's a whole lot more we could say about that. You know, I certainly would welcome your feedback in those conversations. Again, the purpose of Intimate Covenant has never been to be a parenting class, but these are the kinds of questions that we do get asked a lot, and for good reason, and understandably, because, you know, when our own minds start changing or getting challenged about sexuality, it makes sense that we would also want to make sure that we're passing on these right ideas to the people that matter the most to us, which would be our spouses and our kids. So I get that. And if we can help people in their own relationships and even help the next generation, that's, you know, we're happy to try to do that. But we don't pretend to be experts in any of this, nor have we always done this the right way. And maybe we're not doing it the right way now.
Like I said, the conversation that we're having now with a 15-year-old is very different than 9 years ago with that first 15-year-old.
And I'm certain that we'll look back in 10 years and realize all of the ways that we still did it wrong, which is why we're asking for your help as well. So
That's right.
if you have something more to add to that conversation, let's continue that conversation on the boards, or email me if you feel like I really got it wrong and you want to talk to me personally, that we're happy to do that too.
Yes.
So
we want the dialogue.
we appreciate your feedback. As always, we appreciate your support. I have no idea when we'll do this next time, but probably not on a Sunday night.
Yes, clearly
That's definitely
Sunday
seems to
nights
be-
maybe not the night. We've heard that Thursday night's not really a great night for a lot of people, so we'll keep playing around.
We'll
and
keep
see.
experimenting and see how that goes. But
right.
if you're watching this live, or if you're watching this on the recording, thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.